The request lands in your inbox, or across a dinner table, or through a text message. And before you've even had time to consider whether you actually want to do it, a single word is already forming in your mouth. Yes. Your schedule is already full, your energy is already spent, and still some fast automatic part of you agrees before your own preferences ever get a vote. Later, alone, you feel the resentment build, quiet, guilty resentment, because you know you didn't want to say yes, and yet somehow saying no was never really an option that felt available to you. If you have ever rehearsed a simple no in your head for an hour, only to say yes anyway the moment the real conversation started, you already know exactly what this feels like. We tend to treat this as a willpower problem, as if saying no were simply a skill some people have and others don't. But psychology tells a different story. For many people, the guilt that follows a boundary isn't a character flaw. It's a deeply conditioned emotional alarm system, built early and reinforced for years. Welcome back to Milky Way Psychology. Today we are going to break down the psychology of feeling guilty for saying no, where this guilt actually comes from, and what it takes to finally set a boundary without it feeling like a betrayal. Stay until the end because the final section is the one that changes how this guilt actually gets resolved. Have you ever wondered why a simple, reasonable no can trigger a full-body sense of dread as if you were about to do something dangerous rather than something completely normal? For many people, this reaction traces back to childhood environments where saying no to a parent, a caregiver, an authority figure was met with anger, withdrawal, or punishment. Psychologists describe the lasting imprint of this as conditioned social threat response, a nervous system that has learned through repeated experience to treat disagreement or refusal as genuinely dangerous. This means your guilt isn't really about the specific request in front of you. It's an old alarm firing in a present-day context that doesn't actually match the danger it was originally built to detect. If compliance was rewarded with approval and refusal was met with disapproval, you likely absorbed an early unspoken lesson. Being agreeable is how love and acceptance are secured. This connects to conditional positive regard, a concept in developmental psychology describing environments where affection or approval depends on meeting specific expectations rather than being offered unconditionally. Under this kind of conditioning, saying no doesn't just risk someone's disappointment. It risks, at a deep and often unconscious level, the withdrawal of love itself, which is exactly why the guilt that follows a boundary can feel wildly disproportionate to the actual stakes of the situation. Have you noticed that saying no can feel in the moment like doing something genuinely wrong, not just uncomfortable, but morally bad? Psychologists studying guilt distinguish between appropriate guilt, which arises from an actual transgression, and inappropriate guilt, an emotional response triggered even when no real wrongdoing has occurred, often rooted in early conditioning rather than present-day ethics. For many people who struggle to say no, the guilt they feel is almost entirely of the inappropriate kind, powerful, convincing, and completely disconnected from whether declining the request was actually wrong. The feeling is real. The moral verdict underneath it usually isn't. And this leads to the fourth mechanism, because a person conditioned to feel guilty for saying no often develops an entire identity around never having to. Somewhere along the way, being the person who always says yes may have become part of how you understand yourself. Dependable, generous, easy to count on. Psychologists refer to this fusion of identity and behavior as role-based self-concept, where a person's sense of self becomes tightly bound to a specific social function they perform for others. The problem is that when your identity depends on always being available, a single no doesn't just decline a request. It threatens the entire identity built on top of years of never declining, which is why the guilt in these moments often feels less like discomfort and more like a small identity crisis. At the center of most boundary guilt is a lopsided internal calculation. Someone else's momentary disappointment is treated as more important, more urgent, and more real than your own accumulated depletion. Psychologists sometimes describe this imbalance through the lens of asymmetric empathy, a tendency to vividly imagine and prioritize another person's emotional experience while systematically underweighting your own. This isn't because your exhaustion doesn't matter. It's because you have likely had far more practice attending to other people's feelings than attending to your own, which means in the moment of decision, their disappointment simply registers louder than your depletion, even when your depletion is the more pressing reality. Here's something worth testing directly. The guilt you feel imagining saying no is very often more intense than the actual fallout that occurs when you do it. Psychologists call this pattern affective forecasting error, our well-documented tendency to inaccurately predict the intensity and duration of our future emotional states, typically overestimating how bad something will feel before it happens. Most people who finally say no to something they've long felt obligated to say yes to discover that the imagined catastrophe rarely matches reality. The relationship survives, the other person adjusts, and the guilt, which felt so certain and so large in anticipation, usually turns out to be smaller and shorter-lived than expected. And this leads to the seventh and final mechanism, the one that ultimately makes boundaries sustainable. Perhaps the deepest misunderstanding beneath all boundary guilt is the belief that saying no threatens a relationship, when in reality, the opposite is usually true. Psychologists studying interpersonal sustainability describe boundaries not as barriers to connection, but as its structural support, the same way a house needs walls not to keep people out, but to keep the structure standing at all. Without them, resentment tends to accumulate quietly, and resentment, not boundaries, is what actually corrodes relationships over time. Saying yes to everything doesn't protect a relationship. It slowly drains the person doing the giving until the relationship is being sustained by exhaustion rather than genuine willingness, which is a far more fragile foundation than any single honest no could ever be. Put these 7 mechanisms together, the conditioned threat response, the early link between compliance and worth, the guilt mistaken for morality, the identity built around always being available, the imbalance in whose feelings get weighed more heavily, the overestimated fallout, and the misunderstanding of what boundaries actually protect, and the guilt finally makes sense. It was never proof that saying no was wrong. It was the predictable output of a system trained over years to treat your own needs as negotiable and everyone else's as fixed. Learning to say no without drowning in guilt isn't about becoming a colder or less caring person. It's about finally letting your own needs enter the equation at all, not above everyone else's, simply alongside them, where they belong the entire time. If you have ever felt crushing guilt over a completely reasonable no, understand this. You are not selfish, and you are not alone in this. That guilt is not a reliable signal that you did something wrong. It is an old alarm built in a different time for a different set of stakes. You are allowed to decline without an elaborate justification. You are allowed to protect your own energy, and you are allowed, finally, to let your no be simply a full sentence. Thank you for spending this time with Milky Way Psychology. If this feeling is one you've struggled with quietly, share your story in the comments. You are far from alone in this. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe if this video helped you understand your own guilt a little better. Until next time, goodbye.